funny. I've always had a hard time with the word invasive because it kind of villainizes plants. And I think that there's so much to invasive plants that I think we should admire, you know, like their tenacity for wanting to be so resilient, which I think is just incredible. So it's funny. I always have a hard time with that. And we have lots of knotweed here for sure. And there's several other plants that we have that are very invasive. And I'm just trying to change the way I think about that, in that just to remind myself of their resiliency and all the other good things about invasive plants.
So I have this thought that invasivity is like a behavior, right? You know, it doesn't make something good or bad. It's just a behavior. And some plants are non-native, but I don't really consider them to be invasive. Some plants are native, and yet they have invasive characteristics, you know, in that they crowd out other stuff and sort of like want to take over. And then there's like invasive species that I just look at and I'm like, well, yeah, that plant's pretty destructive. Like, I mean, like it really, it's not a bad plant, but it is going to destroy the habitat. And I think that here in Michigan, oh gosh, this is going on like 20 years ago, when we first moved to our place and we did a bunch of work in the yard. Spotted knapweed was sort of like coming up and taking over, and that's this invasive species that is supposed to secrete some compound from its roots that inhibits the growth of other plants and forms like dense monocultures, and you can't ever get rid of it. And I spent a bunch of time digging out of my my so-called lawn, time and energy, and I didn't even get into the field where it was taking off. And you know, 5-6 years later, the only place it was still growing was in the lawn, because the field, it went and it took over the field, but then other plants came and took over the field. And there was like a period of succession where the invasive phase of that particular plant, at least where I live, right? Because that's a whole nother thing to think about, is that plants aren't like an invasive species isn't an invasive species everywhere, and it will behave differently in different places. The places that I didn't touch that other plants started growing in, it's just gone. There's none of it there now. Not a single plant, you know. So 20 years later, not one. There's still like a smidge in our yard, but even most of that's gone. And that is something that happens. There is a plant called ox-eye daisy. You probably have it where you're at, white daisy flowered. I'm going to use the old Latin name because it's so much cooler, Chrysanthemum leucanthemum. And that plant was once called summer snow, and they thought that it was going to crowd out and destroy all the native goldenrods because it was so aggressive. And then it went through its invasive phase and then naturalized, right? So it became went from being an invasive species to a naturalized species, and it wasn't behaving invasively anymore. And that same process will probably eventually happen with things like buckthorn, with the Celastris orbiculatus, the invasive bittersweet vine, except rather than taking like several years, it might take like several decades, right? It might be that the buckthorn creates such dense shade that it allows certain shade-loving tree nuts and seeds to germinate and then grow up through them more slowly and then shade them out where they can't exist anymore. But that process will take a whole lot longer. And in that process, we will lose other plants, you know. And it's not about any particular plant being bad or having any kind of like judgment needing to be applied to it. It's just doing what it is. It's plants they're native to the habitats that they thrive in, more so than like coordinates on a map, you know.
Definitely.
So
Yeah.
if I think about like an urban area, you know, that is all lawns and concrete and not many trees, that let's say black cohosh used to be native in, well, the black cohosh isn't native in that environment anymore, you know. If something is like acres and acres and acres of farmer's field, that's not the kind of soil or conditions that black cohosh is native to. Now there are all kinds of new things that are native to that, and that changes. So we don't want to vilify these things, but I do think that one of the things that I've seen around people who have lots of concerns about invasive species is that it's not just about removing the invasive species, it's about sort of like restoring habitats. And if you remove invasive species without restoring habitats, it seems like it's like not really going to be a winning battle. If we even want the battle terminology, right?
Yeah, definitely. Makes me think of even, you know, a barren piece of land that maybe not a lot can grow on. Maybe an invasive comes in and is able to flourish, and then it changes the soil so that
it changes the soil.
You know, just completely changes landscape. So I think there's so much good in them too. Yeah.
Yeah, but don't bring bittersweet to the island.
Yeah, don't bring it there. If it can grow through carpet, it can grow through anything.
It can grow through your house.
Landscape. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome.